where was Rutherford buried? And there's a lot of interesting speculations and ideas out there. Barbara Anderson took a tour of it, and there's a suggestion that there's a secret grave. It's a good possibility.
The owner and I began to talk about Rutherford. I asked, amongst other things, where was the hillside crypt that the judge was supposed to be buried in before the San Diego County Commission said no. He pointed in the direction where, later on, we saw a small building. And then he asked if I knew where Rutherford was really buried. I said, of course, yes, in Staten Island, New York. He said, no way. He was very emphatic. He said, you are standing on him. I laughed. I looked down. I looked around. We all had quizzical looks on our face, I'm sure. And he said, I mean it. You're standing on the judge. They didn't want him in New York. And so his followers buried him in this garage. The concrete was poured over him. I asked him how he knew. And he said Jehovah's Witnesses, older Jehovah's Witnesses who were connected closely with Rutherford and participated in the burial, told him after he had purchased the house. Then he pointed in the distance and he told us that when he bought Beth-Sarim, there were 7 small cabins located on the property where the judge kept his women. And if we walked over to the area, he said we could still see the foundation slabs of concrete where the cabins were. Well, we really laughed. Well, we were embarrassed. We didn't know what to say, so I changed the subject. I asked him if he would take a minute and show us around.
Now, I have to say, I do find it funny. There's no question in my mind that the society and his personal friends, whether they could legally do it or not, would have him buried there anyway. And with their connections, remember, they found doctors who weren't doctors. I mean, I'm sure there was some funeral director in the society who had a crematorium that might have said, we cremated the body, did this, and then yet buried him. I mean, you could speculate this, and I'm not making that claim, but knowing how they handle things, it could very likely be a reality that he's buried there.
This discussion is a dead end.
Mm-hmm.
So, other...
God.
No, he just got it.
You didn't.
In the February 22nd, 1952 Awake magazine, there's another suggestion, and this is the official report from Watchtower as to where it is. So it says, on Staten Island in New York City, the Watchtower Society maintains a place of burial for members of the headquarters staff, known as the Bethel family. How appropriate it is that the remains of those men who labored together during their lifetime, Rutherford, Van Amberg, Martin, and Woodworth, should be buried there together. Not that we attach importance to the remains or to the spot of burial, but we see appropriateness in the circumstances and know that the unity is a reality.
Well, the very fact that you buried them together in itself shows that you attach some importance to it, or else you wouldn't have gone through the trouble to do that.
Right, and I have a friend who lives there on Staten Island, and I had him go over to the cemetery. There's literally nothing there. There's no markers. There's nothing. The Watchtower owns a little bit of the property, but there's no markers marking the graves of any of these men. Right, so if they are buried together, they would be buried together in Staten Island because we know that Martin, when he died, in Woodworth and Van Amberg, they were buried there. We know that from the documentation. So if this is right, he's buried there, but it's in an unmarked grave. If this isn't right, and it's the other idea, he's buried at Beth-Sarim. Nobody really knows, but those are the two main general ideas that are out there.
I'm going to go with Beth-Sarim, and here's my logic behind this. They didn't state that he was buried in Staten Island. they probably would have included it with all that, but they didn't, so going back with that, the documentation shows who was buried, but why not document Rutherford himself unless you did something questionable, maybe? I mean, I don't know. I find, if anything, I don't find fault with the society over that as much as I find it humorous if it really is true. I wouldn't even hold that against them. I would just laugh and find it funny that they did it.
I'm pretty confident that Martin, Woodworth, and Van Amberg are buried in Staten Island. If they're buried together, Rutherford is there. If they're not buried together, Rutherford's at the other place. But all we have is speculation. We don't really know.
I like my conspiracy theory better.
Point number 8, and this is the last point on our summarization of the Proclaimer's book points. It says Rutherford's wife and son Malcolm also resided in Southern California, where the climate was better for her health. So we know earlier from our 1915 convention report, Rutherford was living in California at the time of his lecturing there. And we discussed his whereabouts in 1915 and 16 in a great amount of detail. We tracked where he was in our discussion on Judge Rutherford's death threat. So if you haven't seen that, take a look at that one. That's one of our more popular videos. So both Rutherford and his wife spent time at that 15 World's Fair. And you can see them in a cart here. Rutherford and his wife returned a few years later, and they made a film about their trip. And we saw that in our More on Watchtower's First Trumpet Blast. Proclaimer's book says that they resided in Southern California. It's very vague. Why is it vague? Where was Rutherford's wife and son? Wouldn't they be in Southern California with Rutherford? Here's a couple more pictures of Rutherford's wife and also their son, Malcolm. Now, Malcolm was a stenographer for Russell at the time. So here's our evidence of where they're located. And it's the census report. So instead of living in Brooklyn or Beth-Sarim with her husband in San Diego, both her and her son Malcolm lived in Monrovia, California. Why? And that, as we say, is another story for another time. So in the New York Supreme Court case, Olin Moyle, this is Rutherford, Bonnie Boyd was one of the secretaries, and she lived there at Beth-Sarim with Rutherford. Why was she living and traveling with Rutherford and his wife wasn't anywhere nearby? She's also listed as a witness on the Beth-Sarim deed of sale to Rutherford. And we know from that newspaper article earlier that we mentioned, she also took trips with Rutherford around the world. So that's very, very interesting. As we said, a future story for another time.
I'm not going to interject anything at this point because we'll just go off track. But we have a lot to say on that discussion when we get to it.
Earlier, we summarized 8 main points from the Proclaimer's discussion on Beth-Sarim. And we've got all 8 of these points and shown there's a lot more to the story than what Watchtower is claiming. Or it's just a complete outright exaggeration of the facts or a complete lie. Each of those points, every single one of them has an issue when we look at the historical documentation. It was an embarrassment to Watchtower. They had to sell it. But, we covered some things in here that I haven't seen anywhere in discussions on Beth-Sarim. I have never seen anything on Dr. Eccles or who he was, that he went to prison, that he was operating without a medical license in the state of California, and all those details. There's a lot of new details that we've been able to find and discover to hopefully add to this discussion on Beth-Sarim. And we're hoping that more details are found in the future that can add and improve the story to give more details, And
it's a forensic analysis of this. We're taking, documentation, because all these points, like Dr. Eccles and all that, add to, hey, wait, what's the real story here? What is the background? What really happened? And as you summarize, this going through here when as we complete our discussion, keep that in mind as each point is summarized, because it's all very important to the history.
Summarizing point 1, said Rutherford had pneumonia after unjust imprisonment. We saw from the documentation he was healthy when he left. He was sick 2 months later.
And 2, he was under treatment by a doctor in San Diego. Well, come to find out, he wasn't a licensed doctor. He was someone listed as a vertebraist. So there's a little conflict in point number 2.
And he went to prison for operating without a license. Point number 3, from 1929 on, he spent his winters at Beth-Sarim. This is the only one that is true, really. Point number 4, it was purchased with contributions, and we know where the money came from. We were able to follow the money. Robert J. Martin got the money from the family business that failed because they couldn't get along with each other, and Dr. Eccles, who went to prison because he was practicing in the state of California without a medical license. Point number 5, the deed and the property was Rutherford's in the Watchtower, but it was deeded to King David and the ancient men of old, which they thought would be princes in the earth. After Rutherford died, they changed that because it was an embarrassment. 1925 was a failure, a prophetic failure for them, and so was Beth-Sarim. It was a reminder of that failed prophecy.
And point 6, elaborating and continuing on that, it was the proof that the men of old would rule on the earth soon. And not only did that not happen, they changed the fulfillment of that to be all Jehovah's Witnesses are now going to be the princes on the earth.
And 7, it was too expensive to keep and it was sold. As we've seen, they had a cash flow problem and they had to get rid of many properties. But they waited on it till after Rutherford died and after they had him buried. And where they had him buried, we gave 2 different views. We gave evidence for both. And 8, his wife was told to live in a warm climate. They neglect to mention she didn't live with her husband or the son, or they lived miles and miles away.
But yet, Rutherford did not spend time alone at Beth-Sarim. There was another woman who lived with him at the place.
Another discussion for a future time. Thank you again, Paul, for another interesting discussion. We have several more planned. Keep studying, keep researching, keep reading.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you again, Paul. This has been a very fascinating discussion. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave some comments. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Get a whole story, not just from the Watchtower's perspective, but from all the various splinter groups. What were they saying? So until next time, keep reading.